Hello and welcome to the new moon reading. 5 days late, I know, but I wanted to get this reading out rather than skip this month because I know that there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the world right now, but there's also a lot going on if you follow the astrology. I am a total amateur when it comes to astrology, but I am all too aware of the fact that Pluto has just changed signs and moved from Capricorn into Aquarius. And I certainly felt that, and I wonder how many of you did too. And it felt like I needed to get the cards out. It'll be interesting to see if that Plutonic energy comes up in the reading at all. Coupled with the fact that all of us are ill here at home at the moment. But I also trust that, given the fact that my mind isn't as sharp as it normally is, that actually sometimes that can shift things and bring through something slightly more dreamlike or dreamy or intuitive. And I am going to offer myself up to the auspices of the intuition gods and hope that this reading makes sense, if not on the normal level that I read on, then on another level. I have 3 cards face down in front of me. I shuffled, cut the deck, and one card in particular, which I put in the middle, presented itself to me in a sort of more overt way than the other two. Normally, I try not to think too much when I draw the cards, but this card sort of tilted off tilted off the top of the part of the deck that I cut, and I just thought, no, that one needs to go into the middle. So that'll be interesting to see what that card is this month. For those of you who know how I read and just want to get going with the sort of meat and potatoes bit of the reading, then please do feel free to click on the card 1 timestamp if that's available to you. And for those of you who want to listen to the introduction, I will make it as brief as possible. It is a 3-card reading. It will only be a 3-card reading this month. And always the card positions have the same meanings attached to them. So card number 1 is foundational. That, of course, suggests that there is something that has already happened that is laying underneath the structure of the reading. So it is paving the way for the reading. Without this card, which is pivotal, then the reading wouldn't be able to sit on top of it. So in other words, without the foundation of this, whatever this card signifies in your life, you wouldn't be able to make much meaning of the other 2 cards. So pay attention to this. The foundation card is always in the past. It could be the near past. It could be so near that it's almost sort of just shifting out. You know, its influence is shifting out from something immediate into something now that is just starting to wane. Or it could be distant past as well. I normally say to people that it is both and, rather than either or. But you'll hopefully be able to identify that in your life in some way. And if not, then don't force yourself to come to any kind of idea about what it might mean. It will reveal itself, I think, to you over the course of the hours and days after the reading. So card number 1, foundational, paving the way, underpinning. The second card, which is the theme card for this month and beyond. So something that is going to be important, even if it isn't taking up a huge amount of time and space in your life, it will be significant. And as I nearly always say, sometimes the most significant things are not the ones that introduce themselves immediately. They are often very subtle, but they have very large ripple effects. So bear in mind that if you go sort of immediately to one thing that you want it to be, then that might not be the case. If you get an intuitive hit, a hit of like aha recognition, then that's probably it. But if you're trying to force the card down a particular route or force an interpretation onto the card or your particular situation, then take a step back and just see if there's something else that is wanting to express itself. That is card number 2, and that is in the current month and beyond. So these cards, they have their influence felt from now forever. You may not always remember them, but they are there, part of that collective, that sort of that Aquarian kind of energy. One way or another, it is going to have a meaningful impact on your life. and also on the lives of those around you, whether that is because of the impact on your life, which then ripples out, or the fact that you see it happening around you as a kind of mirror as to what's going on. And then the final card is the card where you kind of take back control in a way, because whereas the foundation card is one that has already happened, so we don't have any agency in that, not anymore. And whereas the theme card can sometimes be something that seems to arrive, to us, coming from out there towards us. The third card, the agency card or tool card, is where we connect, the inner part of us connects with those outer circumstances. So in other words, we can in some way leverage, lever that an aspect of ourselves or our understanding, our knowing, our insight, in order to meet the current weather and the foundation in a way that feels meaningful to us, in a way that moves us, and moves us not only psychologically and emotionally, but also moves us from the present into the future. So I'm going to go now to card number 1, which is the foundation card. So remember, this card may be waning in influence, but it's fairly recent in terms of its appearance in your life, and or it is something that has happened in the past multiple times, or maybe one significant time in the past, or it's all of those. It's both in the past and also coming up in the present as well. And the foundational card in this month's reading is the Nine of Swords. Now, I'd hazard a guess that the Nine of Swords is probably not one of the cards that we would welcome with open arms. And I would also hazard a guess that the reason why is because we all can identify with the Nine of Swords immediately. I think it is a very fortunate person who is unable to identify with it immediately, or somebody who is still getting to grips with what it is that it means and how that is affecting them on an emotional level. But the Nine of Swords here is a very vivid card, and I think it describes perfectly the kind of state of the cruelty that it describes. And I think that we have all felt this in one form or another, and multiple times. So I would suggest here that, given the fact that it is the card that it is, that this is something that that we are no stranger to, that you're going to be no stranger to the Nine of Swords. But I think specifically it is something that will have happened recently. And it may be psychological, it may be emotional, it may also be physical. So there is, and it could be all three. So let's go and unpack the Nine of Swords a little bit more so we can see how it might have formed in your life and how it is that it is foundational in this part of the reading, what it is that it is trying to say to us in terms of its presence right here, right now. One of the ways to approach the Nine of Swords, I'd have to take a step back. I start talking and then I think, no, I need to go a step back, and then often I'll need to go a step even further. We can only really, or as far as I'm concerned, understand the Nine of Swords in the context of the cards around it, in terms of the chronological order of the sword suit. Now, you know me, I will often describe the cards around a particular card that's come up, sometimes actually to quite a great extent, because it is, and I think in this case that's important, because sometimes we can only really access something that is so immediate, so much of a card that we want to shut down, when we are able to understand it in its broader context. Because by describing and understanding the situation and circumstances, we kind of create a framework which then allows the Nine of Swords to take up its place in a way that perhaps makes it more understandable and therefore more easily accessed or more easily accepted. The reason why I think that and there are many different theories about this, but I think one of the reasons why the sword suit is so damn sharp, and I mean that metaphorically, is that because it's to do with the mind, and we're dealing with something then mercurial, something that is fast, that is like air, which is the element that it's associated with, things can change really quickly. And because of the nature of the mind, we tend to rather head towards things that are negative, generally, than positive. And there will be reasons for that are bound up in our own sense of survival and our own sense of perceived survival as well. So some of those things are going to be really quite primal survival things that we, so we need to look at risk, we need to look at fear, we need to look at things that are going to be dangerous. But there are also things that we have experienced personally in our lives that have felt like a threat to our own survival, even if perhaps on a physical level they aren't. We are no longer, most of us, living in circumstances where we have to fear for our lives on a visceral, on a physical level. There will be some out there who do, and therefore the Nine of Swords is going to feel that much more different, that much more immediate, more palpable, and more tied up with survival on a very physiological scale. But for most of us, it is going to be the survival of the ego against the onslaught of things that it perceives as a threat. And very often these things are things that we have experienced in terms of the threatening of our own sense of security and well-being when we were younger. And because the mind is mercurial, we can go into worst-case scenarios very, very quickly. But the Nine of Swords really starts at the beginning of the sword suit, really. But I'm going to go back to the Eight of Swords to see how it is that the Nine of Swords really comes about, where it springs from. And I'm going to go specifically back to the Waite-Smith version of the Eight of Swords, because I think that really describes the state of the Eight of Swords very, very well. And that is that female figure out in the middle of nowhere. It looks like some kind of sand flats, but she is isolated, and she is loosely bound, and she is blindfolded, and she's surrounded by 8 swords. But of course, from her perspective, she can't see what's going on. And she feels bound, but it may be that she feels like the things that are binding her are actually far stronger than they actually are. And one of the reasons why she feels this way is because she is isolated. There is nobody around her to tell her that that the circumstances that she's in may not necessarily be quite as dire as she believes. There's more to it than that. But there's also nobody around who can help her out of her predicament. And this is the Eight of Swords territory. It is a very physical depiction of a psychological state of being bound up where we cannot see the forest for the trees, where we are so caught in our mental patterns of fear, of survival, of things that may feel threatening, that it brings us to a complete standstill, that we are the prisoners, and we are also the prison guard of our own experience. We are the ones who hold ourselves in place because of our fears. And it's so easy to describe that, and it sounds then so easy to get out of it, and it is so damn difficult to get out of that. So we're talking about deeply ingrained psychological patterns that are around the idea of not being able to empower ourselves to move, of feeling trapped by our circumstances when actually we are the only ones who can free ourselves, which is why there is nobody else on that card. There is a distant castle, I think on a hill in the background in the Waite-Smith version, and that suggests that she is not alone per se, but there is nobody there who can help her apart from herself. So the Eight of Swords suggests this psychological imprisonment in patterns. It's that idea of these deeply sort of worn paths that are these grooves that we get ourselves into that are then very, very difficult to get out of. This is what Freud would have called repetition compulsion as well. The idea that the neurons that are firing in our minds, and again, minds, swords, to do with that, mental processes, are so familiarly firing down these particular. It's almost like a runway at night, with those lights just flashing all the way down the runway. that these neurons fire, and they're so used to firing that one particular way, that it is very, very difficult to think ourselves out of that kind of pattern. It is the default way that the neurons fire in a particular situation. So what we end up doing is we find ourselves in familiar situations, but not only do we find ourselves in familiar situations, but we do the same things over and over again, thereby creating a vicious cycle. And then we lack the tools and the insight, because we're blindfolded and feel unable to move, to be able to shift our circumstances. I'm sure that we can all relate to moments when we've looked at friends and go, why do you keep on fucking doing that? Why do you do that? And it can sometimes be incredibly frustrating to be around people who do the same thing over and over again. Very often with friendships are tested at this stage, particularly around relationships. It's like, why do you keep going back to do this? Why is it that you keep doing that? Because it looks so easy for the person on the outside to change things. But actually, we have all experienced that. It is so difficult when we are in the midst of our own psychological demons it's so difficult to change anything, because of course there we are, there's that runway. That's the only way to go. It's the only way. It's just leading us in. We are just going to go down that path unless something comes in to change it. And there are many ways that you can do that. For whatever predicament that you're up against, there is something that you can do to deal with that. But the thing about it is that we will choose not to seek out those things that could help us very often, because the irony is that actually we would rather keep doing what we're doing than change, because that is terrifying. Change is terrifying and threatening and destabilizing. If we are going down and landing on that runway, we know what we're getting. And that woman in the Eight of Swords is there, and she is isolated, and she is trapped, and she's blind to her surroundings, but she's familiar with that. And perhaps it's safer to be that way. It holds her in place, and then she won't need to open her eyes, and she won't need to look around, and she won't need to change, and she won't need to help herself. She can feel helpless and hope that somebody is going to come in and do that for her. But actually, the only way that she's going to deal with it is to help herself, and that can sometimes be the biggest challenge of all. So there is that moment in the Eight of Swords where there is the potential for intervention, but it's quite hard to do. And that's why I was talking about those, the various interventions that we can do, from some kind of treatment, whether it's intervention from friends, whether there is an external circumstance that happens that kind of is a bit of a short, sharp shock, whether it is therapy, whether it is some other form of counseling, whether it is a lifestyle change, whether it's something visited, from outside to us, that then shifts our path enough to be able to free ourselves from the shackles of the situation that we find ourselves in. But if not, then what we shift into is the Nine of Swords. So it's a kind of logical, if rather crappy, conclusion to the Eight of Swords. So whereas with the Eight of Swords, we are sort of hapless, seemingly helpless individuals in the face of forces that apparently are beyond our control. So we end up giving away our power. I don't like that phrase, but there you go. Giving away our power to external forces because we don't, for whatever reason, feel empowered to extricate ourselves. What happens in the Nine of Swords is that embeds itself more. Those swords move in deeper. There's an extra sword that comes in for complexity. And instead of those swords, as in the Eight of Swords and the Waite-Smith deck, being dug into the ground, the swords start turning in on us. So instead of saying, I'm helpless, this circumstance is shit, the Nine of Swords is, I'm shit, or you're shit, because the Nine of Swords can also be something that is inflicted outside as well. It is a wound that one sustains psychologically because in order to justify staying where we are, we need to come up with reasons as to why it is that we're there. And very often those reasons are around the idea of not deserving anything more. And if we deserve to be where we are, then obviously there is something not right with us. And this is not me suggesting this. This is the self-talk that we say. I obviously deserve nothing more than this. And the reason why I deserve nothing more than this is, X, Y, and Z. So it's that decisive moment where we internalize the voices that we have been, that we've heard in our lives at various stages, and then those people who voiced those things to us, they don't even have to be there anymore. We pick up where they left off, and we then have that punitive voice that then speaks to us about how it is that we are who we are, and why it is that we deserve very little, and why it is that we're not going to move. So from a psychological perspective, it is a very punishing superego. And the superego is the voice of authority. And the voice of authority is the sum total of all of the authority figures, both human and not human, that we have amassed over the course of our lives that have had influence on us. That then if we don't have that sort of intercessionary voice of the self and the ego, can then run riot and tell us exactly what it thinks of us, and we believe it. And all of us will be prey to that at some point or another. This is sounding all doom and gloom, and I don't mean that. I don't mean that at all, because it can feel like that, and that's the Nine of Swords. It can feel incredibly intense, and it can feel incredibly relentless. But that's also part of the mind. That's exactly what the mind does. And one of the challenges is to look at the Nine of Swords for what it is. And sometimes in order to be able to do that, we have to be very honest about how the Nine of Swords can feel. And it's only by being honest about how it can feel that we can take a step outside it, because that means if we are able to describe it, we are actually at a vantage point that is not inside it. And we can call it for what it is. But first of all, we have to be very honest about what it is in order to see how we can get out of that. So from a personal experience perspective, the Nine of Swords is negative self-talk that is now starting to get entrenched, where we start to believe what it is that we're saying to ourselves, even though the origin of those voices aren't our own. So we start to believe it, or that we direct that outwards to other people or to a particular target. But if we are directing it outwards, I would suggest that what we're simply doing is echoing something that was said to us as well. So it's one and the same thing. It is that idea of kicking the cat. It's that idea of displacement, of taking out our pain and our anger onto something else, because and which is pure Nine of Swords territory, because we're also wounding ourselves at the same time. So it is, if you look at the card, you can see there is no room to move. It is an absolute close-up. It's, I think, the closest up card that there is in the Röhrig Tarot. We have got in as far as we can, really, to make sense of the picture of this eye. And of course, eyes are the windows to the soul. And the damage is on the cheek outside. Blood has been drawn. There's barbed wire, and the eye is crying. And I think it's something here about the fact that the soul can see what's going on, and the damage is to the outside. It's to the shell. The soul remains untouched. It's the witness to what's going on, but it's also this idea of defendedness as well. That there is pain involved in getting closer to the truth of something. So the barbed wire is like, you shall not get past here. By crossing this, there is going to be pain. And in that way, it's a way of keeping the world at arm's length. And that's very Eight of Swords territory as well. that idea of feeling in some way, and it is really rather, it's paradoxical, safe in feeling that kind of woundedness, even while the soul behind the eye is responding in a way that's compassionate. There are tears there is compassion. And I think that this is one of the things that's really important to look at, is that that while these things are going on, while we may be experiencing thoughts and ideas that are imprisoning, while our self-talk may be damaging, there is a part of us who is compassionate enough to understand that that's just simply not true. It is grieving, it is mourning, it is telling us that there is another way, and there is another way because what it is feeling is pain. And the reason it's feeling pain is because it knows that there is another, we can only feel pain if we know what pain isn't. And so this idea of the Nine of Swords is both looking at the damage that we wreak on ourselves, and then also by extension on others, but also grieving for what it is that we are losing in the process, which then suggests that we are also the antidote, we are the solution to the situation that we're in, which again goes back to the Eight of Swords territory. We are the only person, you are the only person who can get yourself out of this mess, who can extricate yourself from this. And this is something that is in the near past. So I would suggest that the sting, the sort of open wound is still there. But also what's implied or implicit in that situation is the fact that you also have the solution to this too, and you are the solution. So that's intense, but it needs to be, because we need to pay due respect to the intensity of how the Nine of Swords can feel. But I think we also need to pay due respect to the fact that we are the people who tend to our own wounds. There is an aspect of us that is attending, or who is able to attend to what it is that we are experiencing, what it is, the ordeal that we're going through. We are able to bear witness to our process rather than simply losing ourselves in it. We can be compassionate rather than commiserate. By commiserating, it almost is, that you end up sort of losing yourself in the overall emotion of it, whereas compassion is being able to take a step back and see that there is a bigger picture to it. And it's that, as I said, that taking that step back allows you to get enough space to then take a step in another direction, rather than simply stepping right back in to where you were before, going down that runway again. Those lights leading there. No, you don't have to do that. And so there is this very strong pull towards looking into that eye that's looking back and seeking an understanding not only of the circumstances that have drawn the Nine of Swords forward in this reading as the foundational card, but also seeking out the solution to that, because both are present at the same time. So that's foundational. There is something here in your recent past, and you're probably still feeling the sting of it, and it also may have echoes all the way back to as far back as you can remember, and probably before then, that is to do with turning in on yourself or feeling in some way trapped in the grieving of your own limitations. And when I say the grieving of your own limitations, it's not the limitations that you have over your life, but your limitations in terms of seeing what's possible. It's the limits that we place on our potential to step away from the Nine of Swords, or at least to take the Nine of Swords in the context in which it's given, rather than to get swept up in it. So I think that the tarot deck, no card should be off limits, no card should be avoided. So it's not here about saying that if you have that perspective, then you can forever put the Nine of Swords to one side and you'll never need to experience it again. But rather it is about recognizing the Nine of Swords with those eyes, the observing self rather than the person who's caught in it. And to understand that these things happen. These things happen, they have happened. They're not your fault. But something there needs to shift in order to understand that it's not your fault, but it's now your responsibility. And I think that there is a massive distinction there between fault and responsibility. It may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility now. And if you don't want it to be your responsibility, well, then that's fine too. But remember the Eight of Swords. You're the only one there. You're the only one who can get yourself out of it. You may not have put yourself in it, but, and this is where it's bloody unfair, you are the person who gets yourself out of it. And that's foundational now to card number 2, which is the current weather for this month and then beyond. And that is the Six of Cups. Now, what's really interesting about the Six of Cups is that I immediately thought that it was the card that I'd drawn last month or the month before, but I've just gone back over the new moon readings, and it was August last year, which feels like a very long time ago because the card feels very recent. So what I would do is think back to what was going on in August last year and see if there is some kind of echo of what's going on. Back then the Six of Cups was in the foundation, and now it's in the theme card, so it's almost as if there might be a continuation there, but it's now linked in with the Nine of Swords. And what's interesting to me as well, which is interesting on several levels, is that the Six of Cups isn't the most immediate card that would come to mind in the context of the Nine of Swords for me, given the fact that the intuitive response was really about dealing with pain and anguish. We then have a card that's really not to do with that at all. And we can unpack that because I think that there could be several things going on here that are quite interesting. So we'll go and look at the interaction between the two in a little while, but in the meantime, I'm actually just going to focus on the Six of Cups itself and explain a little bit, because then I think the connection to the Nine of Swords will intuitively just find its way. And the Six of Cups is called pleasure here, and you can see why. There is a lover's embrace here. It kind of reminds me of, for the first time, as far as I can remember, it reminds me of Klimt's The Kiss, and just in the way that they are sort of folded over and around each other. It's almost as if you can't tell where one person begins and the other person ends. And they are draped in these beautiful, sumptuous cloths. There is a feeling of luxury around it as well. And also the idea of the firmament, the skies. The woman has these planets, or sort of, it could be bubbles, but it looks like the skies to me on her. And then the man is sort of more worldly in stripes, with his striped cap as well. But they are totally wrapped up, physically, emotionally, metaphorically, in each other, which is such a stark contrast to the Nine of Swords. Look at that. That is such a stark contrast. But the interesting thing as well is, if I'm going to bring in the Waite-Smith in terms of the Eight of Swords to explain the context of the Nine of Swords here, I need to bring in the Waite-Smith in the context of the Six of Cups as well. And the Waite-Smith deck has these two figures. It is far less carnal, where there is this, looks like a younger male child, except he's taller, sort of solicitously leaning over towards this, what looks like an older woman, but she's smaller. And that suggests a kind of blurring of timelines, which then again suggests that there is the mixing of the past and the present. The Six of Cups in that context, and I think also here, is pleasure revisited. So it is pleasure from the past. And this is coming up in the next month. This is going to be a re-experiencing of something, either with the same person or a similar situation, or there are going to be echoes of something in the past that revisits in a slightly different way or in a different way, but enough to twang those memory strings. But it is going to be around pleasure. It is going to be around particularly physical pleasure, sexual pleasure, erotic pleasure, whether that is then re-enlivened by the presence of someone else or by the presence of the memory of someone else. But there is something here about the past very much being present. So it is a past that is highly charged. That's all I can say. It's charged in to the same intensity as the Nine of Swords, but in a different way. But I think what's going to be happening here, and this is where these two cards are starting to speak to each other, is that level of intensity in the Six of Cups and the level of intensity in the Nine of Swords is going to in some way be like a tuning fork that then meets a like note, and in some way there could be some kind of confusion between which one it is that's vibrating, that it is going to bring alive feelings that are both to do with pleasure and also to do with cruelty, and it's going to be part of the process, I think, over the next month to work out what is real and what isn't, what remains in the past and is simply being dragged into the present as this kind of tuning fork that seems to be re-enlivening a part of your psyche, but actually that may not necessarily be the physical truth that is in front of you. So what's this going to look like on a more mundane level? I'll see if I can come up with a few examples. And they're going to be some ones that are going to be ones that you'd prefer to have happen and ones that are not going to be so great. But remember what I was talking about with the Nine of Swords, that observing self is able to step back and look at these patterns and to be able to step out of them, whether those patterns are ones that are just repeating themselves for their own sake with no immediate external source, or they're ones that are repeating themselves and also coming in as situations that are also repetitions. So in other words, sometimes it's going to be a figment of the imagination and sometimes it could be an actual reenactment in external physical circumstances. And that's going to differ from person to person. But from a practical level, it could be the re-emergence of an old flame, and it could be the re-emergence of an old flame where there were difficult challenges in the past, and then it's up to you to decide whether those challenges are ones that still exist, or whether it is a case of the fact that you've carried that repetition in your mind and you're putting an overlay onto it and actually they don't exist anymore, that there is something that has shifted and changed. It could be either or it could be the emergence of something new that is reminding you of something from the past that then had painful connotations to it that are to do with the Nine of Swords, and that perhaps then it is again about deciding in your own mind whether or not this is something that is legitimate, or whether the Nine of Swords is simply replaying, that you are simply trundling towards that runway again with those lights, and actually the case is that that's not necessarily the truth. You could just zoom off to the left or the right, or you don't have to land there. Whatever it is, the way that it's going to manifest this month is going to have a quality to it that really, really enlivens you, that is a bit of a turn on for a lot of you, that is going to get the juices flowing, that is going to spark the imagination, that is going to be seductive in its own way. And seductive has got really negative connotations, I think, sometimes, and it doesn't have to be. So look at seductive in a way that is neutral, if you can. But then there needs to be a part of you that goes, okay, well then what is seducing me and why and how? And towards what end? To what end am I being seduced? How am I feeling about this? How am I thinking about this? Where is my mind going? Does my mind need to go there? Is this a repetition of something? Is this a legitimate repetition of something? Am I actually sending myself a warning sign that I need to pay attention to, that this is the past repeating itself? Or am I feeling so defended about something that I am worried it's going to happen again? Or am I in a situation where I don't feel deserving of what's happening because in some way my self-talk, which is an internalization of an experience that happened a long time ago, has been telling me that I'm not up to this, that I don't deserve this, that this shouldn't be happening, that I don't have a right to feel what it is that's going on in the Six of Cups. Let's also then expand the Six of Cups. This may be about somebody else. This may be about a specific somebody. It may be about the emergence of somebody new. It may also be a re-emergence of your own idea of pleasure that is simply a spontaneous, or appears to be a spontaneous emergence of your own re-engagement in life, in physicality, that doesn't appear actually to be connected to anything or anyone immediately around you. It will have its roots in something, but it may not be immediately apparent. So you don't need to be looking on the... If somebody's coming, then they'll be there and they'll be standing in front of you, whether they're new or whether they are old, whether they are somebody from the past or whether it's somebody who's just come in. But otherwise, it could just simply be that there is, with the emergence of spring in the northern hemisphere, for example, the emergence of something, of new shoots, of new life, of a new reinvigoration of a sense of purpose. But this purpose is going to be driven by the erotic. So it is libidinal in nature. It may have its output as something that is not libidinal. It may not be about lots of sex or lust or things like that. But it is certainly going to have a creative/procreative slant to it that you can then channel. But in some way it will live up to the idea of pleasure. And that will be something that you won't need to seek out too much to find. In other words, it may not be two people in this embrace like that, but the idea of pleasure, the experience of pleasure will not escape you. But again, go back to August last year for some of you. That may be relevant. For others, it may simply just be a separate occurrence of the Six of Cups. But it will be interesting to see what was going on in August or what was not going on in August as well. Sometimes things are conspicuous by their absence. So have a look at the sort of negative spaces as well as the positive spaces. But in terms of the 9 and the 6, well, if you look at it, the 9 is an inverted 6. So there is a very fine line between pleasure and pain. There could be a sort of sadomasochistic element to this as well. And there is that idea of the interplay between pleasure and pain that could be quite palpable. But I'd suggest also with the idea of cruelty that it's never going to be entirely about pleasure. It's never going to be entirely about that. There is going to be an underpinning of an experience that is one that is in some way formed and shaped by self-talk that is the amalgamation of talk that was directed at you at some point. And it is going to... So there's going to be this kind of knife edge, I think, in some way, of flipping between the idea of pleasure and pain. So instead of it being an entirely erotic experience, it could be this moment of sort of eroticism and then a complete turn-off. And then it'd be interesting to explore what it is that you're shrinking away from, what it is that you're shying away from. Why does the portcullis come down when somebody is wanting to approach the castle. And there may be a very good reason for that, because of the person themselves, because of the individual, or it could just simply be that anyone who approaches the fortress castle has the portcullis come down. So, and again, there will be a reason why that happens. But I think it will be a very, very fertile and productive exercise to look at that exchange between the Nine of Swords and the Six of Cups, and where it is that it can lead into something expansive and beautiful and seductive and gorgeous, and where it is that it will bring up echoes of something that may or may not be worth paying attention to. I mean, either way, it'll be worth paying attention to, but they may not necessarily be worth paying attention to in their present form. It may be that the present form is simply the arrival of something that challenges your own sense of boundaries and your own sense of defendedness. I'm not talking about giving up your boundaries at all, but what I mean is that sometimes we can put in some very, very strong defenses so that we make damn sure that we are never going to be hurt in the way that we were hurt before. Nine of Swords territory. And I think sometimes it is worth revisiting those defenses, perhaps in the company of somebody who is objective enough to be able to explore that with you, to see whether or not that's actually the case, to see whether it's actually worth keeping those defenses there, and it may be, or whether it's worth exploring why it is that we do that, particularly if something is presenting itself as pleasure. So it's a complex interplay here between these two cards, and experiences will differ. It will differ for all of you who are listening. So remain open-minded about what the interpretation is for you. And sometimes if you'll dismiss something immediately and go, oh, well, no, it's certainly not that for me, well, then perhaps it's something that's worth considering more than you might, because dismissing something outright may actually be that Nine of Swords territory. So remain open-minded about what is going on in the next month. And then I'm just looking at the time here, saying, oh gosh, it's probably not going to be a very long reading. That's not the case. So we've got the foundation and we've got the current weather. Now we've got the agency or tool card. So this is where you can meaningfully interact with these two things. So this hopefully will shed even more light on how it is that you can negotiate this interplay between the 9 and the 6. And the tool card in this case is the 7 of Cups. Now, what's really interesting to me with this is, well, two things. The first one is that it's always interesting to have as an agency or tool card a card that is, supposedly negative or one of the more challenging cards. So that's part of it. But the other interesting one is that the first thing that I noticed is that the way that the flower bends is the way that the male figure and the female figure, but particularly the male figure, the angle that they are sort of moving in as well. And then that also makes me notice that the red and white piping down this looks like a drinking straw, down from the top left to the bottom right of the 7 of Cups, which is the debauch card, is also echoed, even with the black edging on the straw on the cap of the male figure in the 6 of Cups. So I think that there is an implicit warning in this, and it's interesting because very often the tool card is a kind of open-ended one. It's like, use it this way, you can use it that way. It's a Swiss Army knife very often. The tool card, it has scissors if you want scissors, it's got a blade if you want a blade, it's got a bottle opener if you want a bottle opener, a corkscrew if you want that. This one feels very specific, and this is probably why the tool card is possibly going to be slightly less long to describe than most other tool cards. And that is that I think that if you look archetypally at the couple in the Six of Cups, the man really has the upper hand there, and I am now going to talk about energies and not about any particular sex, gender, whatever. But I'm going to talk about influences, because I think that this is quite interesting in this case, because I'm not demonizing one person in a relationship. It's not really about that. It's rather more about emphasis. But what I would suggest is that if there is any inequality in a particular arrangement, relationship, meeting, melding that is happening, that is the path towards this, the Seven of Cups, which is the debauch card. And I say that because if you look at that flower there, the petals are being lost, there is parched ground, nothing can grow. And there is a sense also when I look at that mirroring in the Six of Cups, that there is that lack of equality, there is that lack of parity in it. There is a surrender. It's almost a surrender on the parts of both of them, but in different ways. And there is a sort of surrender into each other that is possibly not the healthiest in respect of this reading. With other cards around the Six of Cups, it may be a different way, but because they're aspected in the way that they are, then I have to look at the Six of Cups in the context of the two cards on either side. And what I would say here is that Six of Cups is workable if neither party feels that they have to compromise themselves out of anything. That doesn't mean to be stubborn or to never concede ground. That's not it. But I think there is something here about having to maintain firm boundaries. And I was talking about boundaries in terms of the Six of Cups. I think that there is not to lose oneself in whatever it is that's going on. Yes, it's exciting when somebody new or something new comes along, and then it's so tempting to just go, oh, fuck it all, and just go with the flow. And I think that there is a very strong feeling here of not doing that, or doing that and then possibly having to pay a price about it. It brings me back to a book that I read for GCSE English many, many moons ago, which was The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. And there's this bit at the end of the book that really, really pissed me off, where she ends up, the protagonist or the heroine, she ends up just kind of jumping into a boat with somebody and going with the flow and surrendering herself to the circumstances and losing all agency in the process. And a part of me back then thought that was tremendously romantic to do that, to just simply just throw all caution to the wind, give up the rest of the world, jump into that boat, and and just fuck everything else. And actually, now looking back, that is something here that in this particular reading is basically saying no. It's about maintaining one's own integrity while being in this. It's not about throwing the Six of Cups out. That's not it. The Six of Cups can be incredibly beautiful, evocative, erotic. And it is bounded here in this reading by two very uncompromising cards. So the Six of Cups in and of itself needs to be experienced uncompromisingly in terms of its own boundaries. So in other words, to surrender to each other in that way, to surrender to the situation, to have the situation surrender to you as well. Let's make these two figures archetypal. They can also be personal, but let's make them archetypal. To have that idea of surrender, there also needs to be firm boundaries in place, because otherwise there may be the shifting towards the Nine of Swords, of that idea of cruelty to oneself, the self-talk, the negative self-talk, the self-talk or the talk that comes back to us from others on the one hand, and then debauch on the other, which is this kind of throwing away of resources. It is a total waste of energy, of love. It is addiction. It is all of those things that can just dry up that very vital bed that feeds that bloom. So there are these two, it's like Scylla and Charybdis, and the Six of Cups needs to know itself in the process. It needs to know itself enough to unashamedly be itself, but not to lose itself. So the Six of Cups is about surrender within boundaries. It is to be able to experience that very charged, erotic, alive, vibrant feeling, while also not selling yourself down the river like George Eliot's protagonist / heroine did at the end. It is to be able to remember oneself in order to remember what it is that one has the capacity to say to oneself when one has lost oneself as well. And to not bow to the pressure of things that just tell you to rescind all responsibility over the situation. It doesn't have to lose its sexiness in order to be mindful of what it is that really matters. And if you look at the Seven of Cups, that ace remains on that side of that stem, the left side of the stem. It reminds us, and it's there on the side of the two people in a tryst in the Six of Cups. It is a reminder of what matters, and what matters is love, and what matters is love of oneself first, and then that is extended out. The ace is not, it's not about romantic love. It is and it isn't. It is the love from which all other forms of love spring. So it is a remembering of who it is that we are, and it's a perfect antidote also to the Nine of Swords. When the Six comes knocking, in whatever form it is, whether it is in the form of another person, or whether you are the one who is knocking on somebody else's door, or whether it is the revitalization of that aspect of you that really is set on fire with desire and longing, when that happens, you do not have to lose yourself either one way or the other in order to experience the riches that are there in the Six of Cups. And that Six of Cups will also have echoes of the past as well. But it is about remaining in a sense of integrity. And integrity does not have to be a party pooper in this case. Integrity is simply integrity to oneself in the moment. And, you can fall in love without falling off a cliff. It doesn't have to be that sort of hot-heady flush of youth where everything else can go to hell. It can be both and. It can be that hot-heady flush of youth, but then is also able to say no when one needs to say no, whether that's to somebody else or to oneself. And then that also means that one can say yes to whatever it is that comes in the door. And part of that will be the Ace of Cups itself. I'm going to leave it there. An intense reading. It's quite a fantastic reading. And there's even more stuff that's coming up in terms of what I can see in the cards. I may bring a separate podcast out for a little extra to just talk about some of that. But in the meantime, I'm going to leave this. It is a very long reading. And I will send this off with my best wishes for the best of adventures this month, with whatever it is that comes your way, whoever it is, whether that's somebody else, yourself, both, or just something that brings you alive. Take very good care. Goodbye. you.